We are in a series called The End of Religion. It's this idea that when Jesus showed up, when he came, he put an end to religion. We put an end to all of the rituals, the way we used to interact with God, all the systems, and he showed up himself. So it's not that we don't do religious things, because this is a faith. Faith is part of religion, and religion is part of faith. It's just the difference is now we have a relationship with Jesus. The stuff in the Old Testament was all pointing towards Jesus coming. The stuff meaning the temple, the tabernacle, and the sacrificial system. And when we moved out of the Old Testament into the New Testament, Jesus shows up, then it's an end of the ritualistic way of interacting with God. It's the end of religion. And we're continuing our series. And today I'm going to be talking about Moses. And just to set the scene a little bit, we're in Acts chapter 7. And in chapter 7, a guy by the name of Stephen is preaching a sermon. It's the longest recorded sermon in the book of Acts. And spoiler alert, if you've not done your homework and read ahead, at the end of chapter 7, Stephen is the first martyr. He's the first person who loses his life in Scripture because of his faith. But he begins to preach, and he is preaching about the accusations that have been thrown against him. The same court that tried Jesus and put Jesus to death is now trying Stephen for his faith. So he begins to preach this sermon. 2 weeks ago, we started with Abraham, is where he goes back to the ancestors and begins talking about the entire tribe and all of the fathers of the faith. And Abraham, started with Abraham last week. Give it up for Mark Clark. He did an awesome job. Joseph, and this week, Moses. So we're picking up the story of him speaking of Moses. And I'm going to change things up just a bit. And rather than reading through the entire passage off the jump, I'm going to just take it segments at a time and take a look at some thoughts of the life of Moses. I was telling Cameron and Jeremy Drew earlier today that this feels Moses light. When you're preaching about Moses, like I could preach for like a month about Moses, but we only got 26 minutes. So, come on, somebody. So the first thought, as we talk about the life of Moses, we're going to take a look at verses 20 through 22. But the first thought is this: Moses was sent by God and equipped by God. Moses was sent by God and equipped by God. Let's look what it says. It says, at that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. If you're sitting next to a parent, if anybody's sitting next to a mom or dad, look at them and say, I'm no ordinary child. Come on, somebody. Moses was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. Verse 21, when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. That last part of verse 22, remember that. He was powerful in speech and in action. Get to do this 3 times for the next few weeks, so that's fun and exciting, but it also means that you get the best sermon. Come on, somebody. It means it's going to be a solid 6 out of 10. We all know the story of Moses. Why? Because we've watched The Prince of Egypt, the best movie ever. Come on, somebody. If you've never watched it, I don't even know if you can come to church. Come on now. Several months back, my older son, Charles, sent me a screenshot. He's like, I'm studying, because he was preaching on Moses. It's been probably over a year now. He sent me a screenshot of the movie, The Prince of Egypt, and he said, do you remember when you and Mom only let me listen to this soundtrack? This was the only soundtrack you would let me listen to, was The Prince of Egypt. Come on, somebody. Well, we know the story of Moses. If you don't know, just a quick synopsis, which we'll work our way through, is that Pharaoh had said that he was going to kill all of the Hebrew boys And Moses, being a Hebrew boy, was going to be put to death. So his mother puts Moses into the river in this little basket. I feel like we need the movie playing in the background, man. It's just so many memories. And he gets, he's basically trying to make sure he's safe. So he gets put into this river, and the short story is that Pharaoh ends up in the house of the Pharaoh. Moses ends up in the house of the Pharaoh that's trying to kill him, which is interesting. Moses' story is a great picture of the providence of God. And rather than just preaching through the story of Moses, I thought it would be a good time to sort of like shift into teacher mode just for a second and sort of let us know and understand this theme all throughout Scripture and this theme that's all throughout your life. It's called the providence of God. So let me just take a moment and sort of teach us what the providence of God is. The word providence comes from the Latin word provide, which is two words together. Pro, which means forward, and vide, which means to see. So it might seem as if that word together means to see forward or to foresee. And oftentimes, this is the way we think about the providence of God. My definition for the providence of God is simply and short. It is, if God sees it, he sees to it. It's this idea that God is providing. It doesn't mean that God sees forward, like he looks into your life. So often we think of God this way, that God, because he lives outside of time, we think, well, God can be here in this life right now with me, and he can see forward and see what's going to happen, so then he can go up there and fix things and move things around. It's not that he's seeing forward, it's something completely different. It doesn't mean that he foresees, it actually means he sees to, or sees to it. In other words, he's providing for it. Theologically, this is what providence means. That God himself, if he sees it, he sees to it. God himself, if he sees that something needs to be provided, he provides. The greatest example of this in Scripture, or one of, because the entire Bible is an example of this, but one of the greatest examples is the story we talked about 2 weeks ago with Abraham. The story is Abraham had to go up the mountain, and God told him to sacrifice his kid. Weird story, I know. He's on his way up, and God's like, oh, sacrifice your child. The story goes in Genesis chapter 22 that he's on the way up the mountain, and his son, Isaac, says, hey, Dad. Okay, so this is brother version. Yo, Dad, what up? He's like, yeah, whoa, what's going on? He's like, where are we going? He's like, oh, we're going to do a sacrifice. And the kid's like, okay then, well, I see the wood, I see the knife, but where the sacrifice at though? And Dad's like, well, see what happened was, because the kid's going to be the sacrifice. Okay, y'all not tracking with me on this. It's funnier than what I thought it would be when I said that loud. Anyway, the story goes that as he goes up the hill, he says to his son, God will what? Provide. He gets up there. Before he takes the act, Scripture says in Genesis chapter 22 that there is a lamb that is conveniently stuck in a bush. And God says, there's the sacrifice. He uses that lamb as the sacrifice. And what's so cool is Abraham, in Genesis 22:14, he names that place the place where the Lord will provide. In other words, providence is not that God is seeing forward. Providence is God sustaining, maintaining, and governing the universe and your life. God is never an innocent bystander in your life. God is never a passive onlooker in your life. Even when it feels as if God's not doing anything, God is providing everything, and everything you don't see, he's doing it. It is the providence of God. Where God is looking, God is acting. He sees to it. If God perceives it, then he performs it. If God expects it, he affects it. God is a provider, and it's the providence of God. Why is this important? Well, look at what it did in Moses' life. We said that Moses was sent by God and equipped by God. Check this out. By the providence of God, Moses' mother put him in a basket in the river. By the providence of God, it led Pharaoh's daughter to that exact same river at the exact same time. By the providence of God, Moses, as a baby, at the right time began to cry. And at the right time, by the providence of God, Pharaoh's daughter saw the child in the water. By the providence of God, the king that was out to kill him, he now ends up in the house of that king and being raised by that king's daughter, the one that was trying to kill him, so he could be taught and equipped by God in the enemy's house. That is the providence of God. Is anybody in this building? He became the deliverer, not by accident, but on purpose. And it's sometimes we get this thought, well, and it's a Bible verse, but sometimes we have the wrong theology. Well, God will use it, God will use it, God will use it. Not only will God use it, God did it. And sometimes, and this is where our theology is hard to connect our theology with our heart, because it's great if God did it and it was good. But if God did it and it was bad, it makes up our theology. Is anybody in the building with me? You get quiet now. You're like, I don't know about that one. I don't like that. I like the other one. I don't like that one. And you never see the providence of God looking forward. You only see the providence of God looking backwards. There will come a time in your life, and the person who's clapping is like, I seen it. There will come a time in your life when you look back and you're like, that was God, that was God, that was God, that was God. And here's what you need to know. The things you don't see today that's happening in your life right now is the providence of God. If he sees it, he sees to it. Is anybody with me this morning? The providence of God was active in Moses' life, and the providence of God is active in your life. I don't have much time, but I need to stop right here because I got to camp out right here. Sometimes I don't tell you the why. One of the things I'm bad at as a leader is often I don't say why something. I just say it. Why am I spending time on this? Because I desire, first for me, and secondly for us to have a faith that is not emotional. Although I'm an emotive person, if you haven't figured that out. But we need to have a faith that's based on the actual facts of who God actually is. Not a faith based upon what we feel. Because if we have a faith based upon what we feel, one day you're not going to feel your faith. Y'all not tracking with me this morning. I'm going to keep going. You have to have a faith built on what God is really about. There can be miracles if you believe. Come on. All right. Some of y'all get that later. Verse 23. All right, verse 23. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. When I was prepping for this message, I prepped this message before I went out for having time off, vacation or whatever. And when I got to the verse 23, it says, when Moses was 40 years old. There's a couple interesting things here. Moses' life is really divided into three 40-year time periods if you study his life. First 40, he was in with Pharaoh, and then he goes out into the wilderness for 40 years. And then he is leading and executing, doing the things God called him to do for 40 years. But when I turned 40, 40 felt old. Matter of fact, when I was 20, I used to think that people who were 40 were like 97. You know what I'm saying? You tracking with me? Because when you're 20 and somebody says, you say, how old are you? You're like, I'm 41. You're like, whoa, is that an old man? But when I turned 40 years old, we were living in Oklahoma at the time. I remember distinctly when I turned 40 years old, I had this moment where I just felt like I should be more. I remember the day like it was yesterday. We were living in this little house in a city called Edmond, Oklahoma, and we had a good day. We had a birthday party, and I think we went to a movie, and I'm pretty sure that I had cake because I always have cake because I actually love cake. Come on, somebody. It's a problem. It's actually a problem. And the day had ended, and I was sitting in our living room. I think I was watching a movie, and I had a giant piece of cake, like a big one. And I'm sitting on the couch eating this cake, and I was like, what's wrong with me? I should be better than this by now. And I had this little, not midlife crisis, because it's not really midlife, but I had this little crisis, started thinking about all of the ways that I didn't measure up. Like, I should be a better dad by now. I should be a better father by now. I should be a better husband. I should be better in my career as a pastor by now. I should have saved more money. I should have spent less money. All the things. I should have. And I had this, serious, little crisis when I turned 40. So just quick show of hands. Not ladies, you don't have to, because we don't ask ladies your age. But guys, how many of you had a similar experience at 40 or 40-ish? Show of hands. Okay, you're going to lie up in here. Okay. And even the lady, okay, ladies can participate if you want to. Put your hands up. Look at you doing it now. You having the experience now. Well, I should be, but I'm not. Okay. Just a few of you are honest. Thank you. Here's the question. So how does all this relate to the passage? I'm getting there, people. What do you do with your feelings of inadequacy? Because ultimately, the thing that propelled Moses forward was feelings of inadequacy. The things that almost stopped him actually became the things that propelled him forward. What do you do with feeling inadequate? Because what I learned is it started at 40, but I felt the same way at 41, 42, 43. And maybe some of you in the building today, you're feeling inadequate about something. As if you don't measure up about something. You feel inadequate because you think, oh, my family's dysfunctional. Side note, all of our families are somewhat dysfunctional in some way because we're people. You feel like, well, I'll never be the student I want to be. God can never use someone like me with my past. God can never use me because, I'm just not smart enough, not sharp enough. Maybe you feel inadequate because you feel like, well, I'm not tall enough, I'm not thin enough. Maybe you feel like you're not a great mom because you feel like you don't measure up to the other moms. Maybe you feel like you don't measure up as a father. Maybe you feel like you don't measure up as a leader, as a business person, as a spouse. And I'm not talking about the surface level stuff that we can joke about, but what are the inadequacies, maybe that no one even really knows about you, that place deep down that you feel insecure, inadequate, and you don't measure up. What's interesting is that this is sort of the underpinning of Moses' life. Moses all throughout the book of Exodus. If you want to read the story of Moses, start in the book of Exodus all the way through somewhere in Deuteronomy. But there were 5 big statements that Moses made to God. He had this conversation with God. Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, he says to God, after God says, I'm going to send you to be my deliverer, Moses says, who am I to go? Who am I to go? I told the other 2 services, not every once in a while, every time, not being dramatic, although I'm prone to it, every time I get on a stage like this, there's about 3 seconds before I'm actually on the stage that I think to myself, God, why are you putting me up here? You know me. What are you doing? This is crazy. What am I doing? Why me, God? You know my past. You know what I struggle with. You know how challenging things are. God, why are you using me? This is what Moses said. Why me? The next thing he said to God was interesting. Moses said to God, who are you that you're choosing me? What's funny is that first he's like, I'm jacked up. Then he thought, wait just a minute. If you're picking me, maybe you jacked up. God, maybe there's something wrong with him, right? Moses was like, God, you're crazy. You're going to use me? Then he says, the people won't believe me. Insecure, inadequacy. Then he says, check this out. I told you to hold that part of the verse to the side, and it matches up with this. He says to God in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10, he says, I don't have any skills. And God chose him, and God sent him to Pharaoh's house so he could be trained. But the way he saw himself was unskilled. And then at the very end, Moses says, please send someone else. Just send someone else. Anybody but me. You know what this is? This is his inadequacies. This is his insecurities. And this idea of the end of religion is not so much of the end of the practice of our faith as in the end of us feeling as we have to measure up to be accepted, because we don't have to measure up to be accepted by God, because God reached down and accepted us just the way we are. Is anybody in the building? The same way God chose and equipped Moses, check this out, God chose you and equipped you. If you were a mom, God chose and equipped you to be a mom. If you're a dad, God chose and equipped you to be a dad. If you lead a business, God chose you and equipped you to lead that business. God chose you and he equipped you. God not only chooses the inadequate and the weak, he only uses the inadequate and the weak. Check this out. Here's why. Because the ones who think they're strong enough are also strong enough to say, I don't need him. God uses us not because of us, but in spite of us. Next thing Moses acted. He did something. The story goes that in verse 24, 5, is that, we'll throw it on the screen. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. So Moses does this thing where he knows on the inside that God has called him. And he knows that God has called him to do something. So he begins to act on the thing God called him to do. Here's the thought. Moses had the right passion, but the wrong action. He saw injustice happening, and he knew that he was chosen to deliver God's people. The right passion, but the wrong action. I get upset about goofy stuff all the time. The question is, do we get upset about the things God gets upset about? Another way to phrase it would be, does what breaks God's heart break your heart? Are there things that you see in this life, in the world, that you say, man, that breaks my heart? Because I know it breaks God's heart. When you see injustice, you think, man, that breaks my heart because I know it breaks God's heart. When you see a race or nationality being mistreated because of their race or nationality, does it break your heart? You see a man or woman mistreated because of who they are, does it break your heart? Does the things that breaks God's heart break your heart? Do you have the right passion? And the reason this is important is because I really believe that if our hearts were broken by the things that break God's heart, I believe the church, and not Bayside Adventure, the church would affect the world more. The next thought here is that Moses was rejected by the people that he was sent to deliver. So he does this thing, and then he's trying to talk to his people, and he's like, hey, don't be fighting. And the guy's like, what are you going to do? You going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian guy? And they reject him. And Stephen specifically in his sermon is pointing this out because he is talking to a group of people who are doing the same thing. That God's people, the nation of Israel, had a pattern of rejecting everything that God sent to them, people and places, because it didn't look like what they were expecting. And Stephen is pointing out, you rejected Moses, you rejected Joseph, as we talked about last week. I wonder how many times we have rejected something because it didn't look like what we expected it to look like. I can't remember on a weekend telling this story, but I've told it on different events and whatnot. But when I first came here to preach for the very first time, almost 5 years ago now, a friend of mine who was actually also a friend of Bayside, we worked together at another church, and he was just a friend of mine who also was a friend of some of the guys around here, calls me up and he says, hey, there's a church in Northern California that wants you to come preach for them. And I was like, nope. Why do I want to go to Northern California to preach? I'm preaching at a church here. I got stuff to do where I'm at. He kept calling me. It was over like a month period of time, and he'd call me and call me and call me. And he's like, man, they just want you to go. He's like, it'll be fun, to go out to California and hang out. It'll be fun. And I just kept telling him no. Till eventually I was like, okay, I'm off a couple of weeks. I'll go out there and preach or whatever. So I came out here. I flew in. Shelby didn't come with me simply because it was a short trip. I came in on a Friday. I get here on a Friday afternoon. I go to the hotel, wake up on Saturday, come over here in the afternoon, and I preached for the first time Saturday night. And that night, a bunch of the guys, Bayside guys, took me to dinner. So we're sitting around at dinner, and they're like, well, how'd you like it? And I was like, fine. They were like, well, how'd you like the church? Fine. How'd you like the people? Fine. It's like, oh, cool. It's like, all right, well, hey, did you know we're looking for a pastor? And I was like, good for you. They're like, no, we think, man, it'd be great. You should come. It'd be awesome. And I was like, listen. There is no way that I would ever even consider moving to California. Not gonna happen. I kept saying it over and over and over again. I was very emphatic about it. Then I went back to the hotel. I called Shelby, called my wife, and I said, babe. She's like, what? And I said, these jokers are trying to recruit me out here. And she says, well, of course they are, you dummy. Why else would they fly you all the way to California? And here I stand. I wonder, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. That was not how that was supposed to end. How many times have we missed what God is trying to do because it doesn't look like what we thought it would? Don't miss what God's trying to do because it doesn't come in the package you thought it should show up in. The next thing is probably the most important part of the story. And that is the fact that Moses meets God. He is in the wilderness. You know the story. There's a burning bush. He goes up to it. God speaks to him from this burning bush. And sometimes I think, we sort of under-spiritualize things in the Bible. We read them and it's like, oh yeah, bush is burning, God's in the bush. Oh yeah, okay. But what's interesting is what happens next sort of sets the tone of how we actually should interact with God. Because the passage says that Moses would not dare look into the bush. Why? Because meeting God face to face, really not even actually face to face, I don't know that we have the intellectual ability to understand what that would actually be like. I mean, I have these scenarios I play in my mind about what heaven is like. It's like, oh, I'm going to walk in and high five Jesus and be like, what's up? You know, fist bump, you know, chest. All right, bro. We made it. But have you ever stopped to think about the other side of God that we don't think about as much? Like I work really hard, actually work really hard every weekend that I communicate to try to make probably the figure who seems the most inaccessible, God, more accessible. Try to make him more relatable. But the actual fact is that God is not relatable to us at all because he's God. You forget, we all forget. And when Moses said he couldn't even look in the bush that the presence of God was, it was because there's a level of awe and a level of reverence that I believe we have lost as followers of Jesus. That the same God that created everything out of nothing is the God that we interact with. The God that pumps blood through your veins. That God that puts breath in your lungs. That God that made every cell in your body and also made the entire universe. The God that spoke and everything that wasn't was. A God so mighty and strong. A God that if you saw him face to face, it would both be the most life-giving experience and the most terrifying experience because he's God. We've lost how big God is and how reverent we should be towards him. And we come into church and out of church and we treat our relationship with God like he's our best friend. He is a friend that sticks closer than the brother, but he's also God. He's the God of the universe. I don't have the vocabulary to try to explain or the emotions to emote who God is to the degree that we can actually fathom it. There's a level of worship and respect and honor that is due him. Check this out. Not because of the prayers he did answer or the prayers you want him to answer or what he might do or what he did, simply because of who he is. It's God. Which leads me to the last thought. God's presence changes everything. The story goes, after he says, I'm the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then he looks and tells Moses, take off your sandals, because where you are standing is holy ground. There's an interesting little fact about this. And the fact is that Moses would have been taught by the Egyptians in Pharaoh's house that when a king enters the room, you take your shoes off. So God interacts with him in a way that he understands. He's not a presence. He's not a disembodied spirit. He is the king. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do with our sense of inadequacies, our failures, our hurts, habits, and hang-ups? What do we do with them? We bring them to the foot of the cross, into the presence of a king. Why? Because God's presence changes everything. It wasn't that the place was holy. It was that a holy God was in that place. So here's what you need to see. And I wanted to end our service just a little bit different this weekend. Wherever you're standing in your life, if you've accepted Jesus, you're standing on holy ground. Struggling to be the mom you want to be, God's with you. You're on holy ground. Dealing with a struggling relationship, God is with you. You're on holy ground. You're fighting through and wrestling through depression and anxiety, God is with you. You're standing on holy ground. Living paycheck to paycheck, trying to make ends meet, with no foreseeable hope in the future, God is with you and you're standing on holy ground. Lost a loved one, your heart is shattered in a million pieces, God is with you. You're standing on holy ground. Fighting through a sickness, God is with you. You're standing on holy ground. Don't measure up. Not even sure why you came to church this morning. God is with you. You're standing on holy ground. What do we do with our broken lives? We do just like Moses did. See, Moses had a formula. He supposed that he wasn't adequate enough. But he didn't stop at just supposing those things. He then took those inadequacies and he disclosed them to God. And that's actually the miracle of it. Because what happened is that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords took Moses' mess of a life and used him to do a miracle. Whatever you're going through, whatever's got a hold of you, God still has a plan for you. I wanted to close us with worship today and not an emotional plea. I'll do that next time. But actually give us the opportunity to put God in his rightful place. To put God in the place of worship. So I want to close with us as a church family trying to engage this thought of Almighty God, of King Jesus.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. We're so glad that you're here. We upload brand new messages right here every week. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you never miss out. Also, feel free to follow us on any of our socials, Bayside Adventure. And then to get connected, you can text adventure to 56316. We'd love to connect with you and walk out this thing called life with you. Thanks again for watching.